Now, after the welding, first we have discussed the different welding processes and principle of the fusion welding process. Then we discuss the brazing and soldering, that is another joining process, and now we will try to discuss the adhesive bonding. This is also one kind of the joining process. We will try to look into the basic principle of the adhesive process and what are the different methodology techniques can be used in case of the adhesive bonding process. So, what are the principle of the adhesive bonding? So, in adhesive bonding, the joining process in which the filler material is used to hold two or more than of the components, and they are closely spaced parts together by simply the surface attachment. So, in principle this is different from the fusion welding process or soldering or brazing process. So, here the joining of the between the two components is done using some, we can say that some other type of the filler metals, or filler metals means here the adhesives with or without the application of the heat, may or may not be the necessary of the application of the heat. So, the in that way this is different from the any kind of fusion welding processes or brazing and soldering process. So, when you use the adhesive to join between the two substrate, if you look into the figure, in this case the substrate 1 and substrate 2 will try to join using some adhesive. So, the most important factor using the adhesive, the type of the adhesive. Second important point is that when you join substrate 1 and substrate 2, what will be the gap, that means what will be the thickness of the adhesive. The joint strength of the joint can vary depending upon the nature of the adhesives and depending upon the thickness of the adhesives, and maybe other secondary requirement are also there to get a successful weld joint simply by adhesive bonding. So, in principle that it follow the surface attachment between the two components. So, therefore, when you use adhesive should have some quality such that it will try to wet the surfaces, both the surfaces which surfaces we are supposed to join, and it exactly adhere to the surfaces and develop the strength after it has been applied. That means, when sometimes the simply putting the adhesives and there is a necessary to keep it keep hold on for a long time, and that means that is called the curing process. So, in that after curing the joint between these two surfaces and simply wetting the surface, and but this joint should be remain stable after a certain period of time. So, this adhesive bonding happens, but to get the successful joint using the adhesive bonding, there may be some that this process can be explained in the two terms. One is the surface preparation and the curing. These are the two significant terms. Based on that, adhesive bonding can be explained in better way. First is that surface preparation. So, definitely the workpiece surface, like fusion welding process, also to get the successful weld joint, it is necessary to clean the surfaces of the workpiece or substrate material before welding. Similarly, here also some surface preparation are necessary to get a successful weld joint with the application of the adhesives. So, part surfaces must be extremely clean such that, because the bond strength actually depends on the degree of adhesion between the two surfaces or two adhesives, between the adhesion between the surface and the adhesives and the parts, that actually very much links to the cleanliness of the surface. So, therefore, extremely clean surface is required in this case. Second, but other points for the surface preparation, this I mean how the surface preparation can be done in case of the metals and in case of the non metals. So, in case of metals, actually we using the solvent wiping after use for the cleaning, often used for the cleaning purposes, and then roughening of the surface is also required. Sometimes the sandblasting techniques is required to improve the surface roughness of this material, but surface may not be too rough, then there may be the other difficulties, but certain roughness is required so that wetting action can be good by the adhesive to the surface. But for non-metals, the roughness is improved sometimes the mechanically, or sometimes we can use the chemical etchant also to increase the roughness. So, in general the surface preparation for the adhesive bonding is the first one, the cleanliness. Secondary thing is that some sort of roughness should present in the surface. And next, curing, there is another component of the adhesive bonding is that curing action. So, this is the process by which the physical properties of the liquid adhesive changed when it is changed to the solid, comes to the solid phase. So, that comes usually by some chemical reaction. So, in this case the curing can be done carefully in the adhesive bonding process. So, it is often used curing can be done with the aid of the heat sometimes, or sometimes we can use some catalyst for the curing purpose of the adhesives. So, if there is a need of the application of the temperature during the curing purpose, but that temperature may not be too high, it should be very low, relatively low. But the main disadvantage of this process is that curing times is relatively takes a very long time. So, that is why production rate is relatively slow in this case. So, that is the disadvantage of this process. So, sometimes it requires to applying the pressure also. So, that applied pressure activate the bonding between the two substrate materials. So, what now we come to that point, that what are the typical methods of application of the adhesive, what way we can put the adhesive between the substrate material. So, it's simply manually we can do the simply brushing, but when you do the manually this thing, there is a possibility of the uneven coating, coating may not be the very even, and that means there is a variation of the thickness over the surface. So, that is the one thing, the simply brushing. Sometimes we can use the manual roller similar to the paint roller, but in this case definitely we can maintain the smoothness of the surface, and but since it is doing the manually, so there may be the possibility of the variation of the thickness also. Silk screening also, sometimes this is the another methodology to application of the adhesives. So, simply brushing through the open area of a screen, and screen that actually used to coat the selected. If you use the screen, it is possible to use the putting the coat of the selective part, selective area, or selective area of the component. So, this method is sometimes applicable to application of the adhesives. And flowing. So, usually sometimes use the manually operated gun for the flow gun, basically that is required, and when there is a consistent control of the is required and advantageous as compared to the simple manual brushing process. So, these typical methods for the application of the adhesives to the substrate material. So, after application of the substrate material, then there is a need, may or may not need of the pressure, aid of temperature, or sometimes we can use these adhesives along with some catalytic element, so that it can accelerate the chemical reaction during the process, so that the curing can be done. That means, the change of phase from liquid to the solid phase can be done quickly also. Now, if you look into the typical failure modes on the adhesive bonding, when you after the making the bonding, what are the typical failure mode of the adhesive bonding? The three possible mechanisms. One is the structural failure. Here we can see the internal failure of a substrate material in the region close to the joint. So, failure is more to the substrate material with structural more to the substrate material, not actually the not failure exactly happens inside the components of the adhesive part. Then adhesive failure mean interfacial failure resulted in a specimen of one of the substrate from the adhesive layer. So, near about the adhesive layer there is a failure. If you see the figure adhesive failure figure, here you can see there is a small component of the adhesive is disappear. So, actually failure happens near about the substrate material and one layer is absent in this case. So, that is the typically called the typically mode is the adhesive failure. Cohesive failure, if the internal failure occurs in the adhesive layer, if you see look into that thing, it is a completely the failure is completely on the layer of the adhesive within the adhesive volume itself, that is called the cohesive failure. So, these are the three different types of adhesive failure modes we observe in case of the adhesive bonding. Now, classification of the adhesive, what are the different types of the adhesives can be used? There are different way or different types of the adhesive materials can be used for the adhesive bonding, but here we try to do the classification based on the load carrying capability. So, depending upon the load carrying capability, the adhesives can be defined as the structural, semi-structural and non-structural. These three different types of the classification can be done based on the load carrying capability of the weld joint using the adhesives. But to do that, one is the important point is that glass transition temperature, which is very much related to the polymeric material, and that the temperature decides in such a way that above which the polymer are rubbery, like polymer becomes like chewing gum, large deformation can be done, and below which it is like the glassy type of structure we can observe. So, that sometimes we use the in polymeric material, or maybe we can that the important temperature is the glass transition temperature, which is maybe equivalent to the melting point temperature in case of any kind of metals, So, structural adhesives are basically the relatively strong adhesives that normally used basically oil below their glass transition temperature. So, oil below the glass transition temperature, that means the adhesive looks like here the it's written the structure like the glossy structure. So, two groups, thermoplastic and thermoplastic groups, they actually form, they can be examples for the structural adhesives. But we know that thermoplastic and the thermosetting plastics, thermoplastic they actually becomes softened at the basically high temperature, but thermosetting they becomes harder with respect to the temperature. So, common examples of the structural adhesives are basically epoxies and this acrylic, these are the typical adhesives we use for the joining of the components. So, if we look in the semi structural, in this case the application where the failure would be the less critical. So, in this case the failure would be the less critical, we can use the semi structural adhesives or semi structural joint, and non structural the strength is not important here, the non structural here the application is done based on the aesthetic purposes. So, these are the if we look into that three different types of the adhesives, the structural, semi structural and non structural adhesives, and based on the load carrying capability, structural adhesive is the having the good load carrying capability, semi structural a little less than that, and non structural even it is not the load, here the importance are given to the aesthetic purpose of this adhesives. So, these adhesives are joined for the adhesives are used for the joining of the components, but in general if you look into the overall what are the advantages and the limitations of the adhesive joint, you can summarize like that: the ability to join dissimilar materials, that is the one advantage for the adhesive bonding, definitely, which is the similar typical to the other welding processes or like brazing and soldering also. So, sealing properties, adhesives, it is having the good sealing properties using the adhesive, because it generally try to fill the gaps and the voids, and definitely adhesives sometimes most of the cases we use the very thin layer and invisible joint, but good joint strength can be achieved, and the adhesives using some additive agent, the adhesives can be improved electrically or thermally conductive or insulating, whatever requirement, that kind of flexibility is there also using the adhesive joints between the components. And of course, the adhesive joints is actually eliminates the any of galvanic corrosion. So, using these things, corrosion resistance can be improved using the these adhesives on the during the adhesive bonding, or if you simply use the adhesive layer upon the any kind of components. But if we see the negative side or maybe disadvantage of this adhesive bonding, the first is that it requires careful substrate surface preparation. So, surface preparation is one important factor. One is the cleanliness and the roughness. These two are the important parameters for the successful weld joint using the adhesive bonding. Service temperature, and having some limitation on the service temperature, most of the cases it is below 180 degree centigrade, and also environment limitation. So, certain it is a environment effect is also there, and for the service life of a adhesive joint, but main limitation is the application of the temperature. So, above 180 degree centigrade temperature, the adhesive joint fails basically. So, that is the important limitation of this type of joining. It may change properties during the service. So, that is another risk, that if you cannot assess the changing properties during the service, then probably it cannot be a very reliable joint process. And the main, in terms of the production of this process, is the main disadvantage is that high curing time, that makes the production time is very high for this adhesive point. So, this is another disadvantage, and difficult to disassemble the joints. Like soldering joint, it is a simply by applying the heat we can easily disassemble of the joint, but once the adhesive bonds has occurs between these two components, then it is difficult to disassemble again. Okay. So, necessity to hold together two joining parts during the cure. Sometimes since the curing time is very high, so during the whole curing time it is necessary to hold on the two components or two substrate material until unless it finishes the curing time or for the joining of this two components. So, these are the although having the several disadvantages or even having some advantages of adhesive bonding process, but sometimes the adhesive bonding is very handy process we generally use. Typical application of the adhesive bonded joints, we find out the practical application of the adhesive bonded joints, the automotive, aircraft, building products and shipbuilding, packaging industry, footwear, furniture, book binding, electrical and several electronics industry. We can find out the application of the adhesive bonding, or we can find out the adhesive bonded joint in this typical industry or typical field.